If you use hitting as punishment for your children, why? I've been hit once by my dad for kicking the dog really hard out of rage as a child. I'm not saying it's right, but I'd have done the same. Never hurt an animal since. This is one of those exception that proves the rule situations. Hitting children teaches them how awful it is to hit someone because you're bigger/stronger. In this instance, punishment perfectly fit the crime. Usually, not the case. One of my exes was a notorious biter when he was a child until his aunt bit him back. Edit, based on all the comments I've received, this is a common and effective way to teach kids not to bite. I'm not down with physical punishment by default, but I think situations like this are acceptable because you're repeating the same action back and teaching the child how it feels as their victim. It seems that as soon as they learn that biting hurts, they stop doing it. That's how my mill got my wife to stop biting as a child. She would bite everyone until my mill finally had enough and showed her how much that shit hurts. Wife still bites sometimes, but only in a playful manner. I did this to a kicking niece. Everyone just took it and told her to stop. Her parents gave her timeouts. Then she kicked me. She was wearing some sort of patent leather dress shoe, and the hard leather of the sole stuck out past the toe of the upper, and she kicked me hard. It hurt. So, I kicked her back. She limped away crying. Her parents laughed, shrugged and said, "We told you to stop." She stopped kicking people that day. They say violence never solves anything, but I don't think that's true at all. Insufficient violence never solves anything. Why were you so mad at the dog? Accidentally pulled the plug on a game I was playing. Someone did a study on this after watching parents prank their kids by unplugging consoles and filming their reactions. It's on YouTube. Something like cortisol is high when playing games, but dopamine is countering it. When plug is pulled, it drops dopamine, but cortisol is still there. Since your prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed when young, you can't quickly find an action to bring back your dopamine, so you kind of just explode. So I will give an honest answer. I have spanked my 2 kids a grand total of 3 times. I'm 100% against spanking. But in a moment of tired, exhausted, frustrated single mom, toddler hell, I showed weakness. 2 of the times were when my toddler decided to bolt into danger. The other time I was trying to get my daughter's diaper on. She was screaming, crying, fighting me. It had been a long day and I just needed to get her diaper on before driving home. She kicked me so hard on the boob. I was still breastfeeding and it hurt so fucking bad. And I reacted by popping her on the bottom. Once again, not proud of myself. It was a moment of weakness. Here's the terrifying part. It worked. That actually freaked me out. It was like cheating. I can see why parents do it. It's a horrible way to get your child to do what you want. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate the honesty. Parenting can be quite difficult at times. Especially if they are putting themselves in serious danger. Once a family friend's toddler was chasing a ball across the yard and into the road. I was 13 and ran after her, grabbing her shoulder pretty hard and yanking her back from the literal edge of the road as a car was coming, and slapped her wrist. She cried and was pissed at me. Her parents weren't strict, so in her mind I just beat her with a belt. Sometimes kids need a sudden oh shit moment to understand this is serious. You're past the point of a gentle don't run into the street. The only time my mother ever hit me was when I almost put my fingers in the socket. She slapped my hand out of the way in a panic and apparently I looked at her with fear in my eyes. It's been 33 years and she still feels bad about it. When I was a kid I would randomly run off. It drove my parents mad, especially as my mom is disabled so can't move so fast. They tried everything to stop this behavior. Once I went to run into a road, I remember the car swerving a breath from my nose. My mom yanked me back and in an amalgamation of rage and terror she smacked my ass so hard I lost all sense of body and being. I never once bolted again after that. I barely remember it, and while my dad would smack me as a final warning, my mom didn't often. My personal perspective is I will do my best to never smack my child, but I imagine I'd rather smack the butt than see them ran over. He doesn't hit them, but my friend makes his kids run laps in the backyard if they're being bad. This reminds of a punishment my friend had when we were teens. She was caught drinking and her parents made her move a pile of bricks from one side of the backyard to the other and back while hungover. 18 years later and she still to this day hardly ever drinks, and never to the point of having a hangover. There's a name for this but I can't remember what it is. It's a form of psychological punishment that's used on prisoners for a long time. Forcing them to do a knowingly mundane pointless task, then undo it for no reason. Standard military training in some parts when no real work is available. My dad loved to tell the story of how him and his cousins got drunk one night and realized they couldn't go home because their moms would have killed them. They went to their uncle's house, who woke them up at 5 a.m. by banging on the basement pipes above their heads. Armed with a 5-gallon bucket of paint, an empty bucket and painting supplies, he kept them down there all day painting the basement and puking in the empty bucket. He promised to never tell their mother, but they weren't allowed to tell her about the free labor either. I, reluctantly, only spanked when one of my kids were injuring a sibling and wouldn't stop. It was probably less than 4 times between 2 kids. We were buddies again very soon after. Thanks for being one of the few comments that actually answers the question. Sue annoying lol. Like all the top comments are not parents who have hit their kids. Not a parent, but I was frequently spanked, and it was obvious that she did it because she was angry. Mom wasn't mature enough to regulate her own emotions and would spiral into a screaming whirlwind of hands and nails, at the smallest provocation. She sometimes non-apologized afterwards. I'm sorry, but you need to stop making me so mad. I didn't care for being hit, so I avoided it as often as possible by becoming an excellent liar. My experience is pretty similar. My parents never used physical discipline as punishment, but my mother would just lose control or her temper and hit me or throw something at me. She also yelled a lot, and I definitely learned that I needed to avoid her as much as possible, keep physical barriers or distance when I could, and try not to upset her, even if it meant lying or doing something wrong. Definitely a lot worse to have someone chaotic and unpredictable. My grandparents spanked me as a young kid, and it really wasn't that bad because I got warnings first, and it was very measured. With my mother, I didn't know when or how she would lash out at me. My 4-year-old, when put into timeout, bursts into tears. No timeout. Try spanking. Instead of timeout, do spanking. I think timeout was pretty effective. My son screamed bloody murder for the entire time whenever we put him in timeout. It got to the point where he would be screaming himself hoarse and I'd be downstairs staring at my wife and wondering if a quick spanking would have been kinder than this. He's old enough now to be sufficiently addicted to his Nintendo Switch. I stole this idea from somewhere else, but I don't even take his Switch away when he's bad. I take the charger. So he has to watch it slowly die and know he won't be able to charge it again for a few days. When they eventually figure out that they can charge it elsewhere, Nintendo has an app for parental controls that lets you set time limits or lock it remotely. That's a good way to get your kid to learn hacking. Child learns new useful skill, you then take the charger. Win-win. What's the meme? If your child is old enough to understand why you're hitting them, then explain it to them and don't hit them. If your child is not old enough to understand why you're hitting them, then don't hit them. I love this. Tried to tell this to my parents who regularly spanked me growing up and they just could not wrap their heads around it. Now I just cry on cue when I'm in trouble because I was taught that I will be physically punished and there is nothing I can do or say to change that. I'm a grown woman and it pisses me off so much, but it could always be worse lol. AITA, the responders who have voiced similar experiences. My heart hurts for y'all. It's amazing what the internet can randomly connect people with, and I hope you all are finding comfort and peace in whatever way you are able. I was beaten as a child, for what my father deemed educational. Not a slap on the hand or a swipe at the back of the neck, mind you. And what I learned. The day my father died was the beginning of my life, and I'm still dealing with anxiety and social performance issues. I will never have kids, F40, because I don't know how to handle them and afraid I will respond with violence. Completely cut off my mother from my life since she was around at all time but never interfered. I don't think kids should be allowed to do anything without proper limits and discipline, but it's a thin line between education and abuse. I was parented like this. It started with mild spanking but at times could progress into hitting, kicking, throwing, etc. I didn't take beatings or consider it physical abuse, but it was definitely traumatic on a deeply emotional level. Of course, none of that was effective parenting and it probably contributed to a significant amount of mental issues I struggle with as an adult, including a strained relationship with my parents. Unfortunately, I've inherited some of the anger and impulsiveness from my parent that did this to me and I'm deeply afraid of how I'll treat my kids as a parent. I feel so fucked up from how I was raised that I wonder if it's morally acceptable for me to even have kids. If you're a parent that does this or thinks it's okay, please consider showing compassion and love to your child instead. Seek help for your anger issues or whatever is causing you to snap. Your kid might be a pain in the ass, but at the end of the day you're the adult and the responsibility is on you to be an example for your kid. This is one of the 30,000 reasons as to why I'm not having kids. My temper is horrible when I'm stressed, overwhelmed, overstimulated. I'm working on it, but I don't want to risk being the mom that I had growing up. I commend you for making that decision. I actually have pretty good patience in stressful situations, but I've come so close to wanting to spank my toddler at times. I feel like you're parenting yourself when you have kids. I'm constantly trying to figure out ways to regulate my emotions because they're my own, and not my kid's fault. Meanwhile, Indian parent laughing at the comments. Hispanic and Chinese parents as well. They don't just spank. Lol. My tia once threw a chancla at me, I swear to God, from 200 or so feet and nailed me in the back of the head while I was running away full speed. First and last time I ever pushed my cousin into a cactus. My aunt and uncle were determined not to spank their kids, agreed before they even got married, read all the books about why not, prepped all the alternatives when they were expecting. Then their first child was an absolute nightmare. Like every instant he wasn't getting exactly what he wanted from about 18 months old, he would scream and cry until he almost or did made himself vomit. They had done all the things you're supposed to do to prevent that behavior from the second he was born, and it didn't matter. They did timeouts, took things away, sat with him in quiet rooms until he calmed down, explained why what he did was wrong, once he was 3-ish and could understand. He saw therapists and behaviorists. Nothing. It nearly ruined their marriage, and our entire family actively dreaded being around them. No one wants to feel that way about a preschooler, but God, we did. And at some point when my cousin was 4 to 5, they discussed it at length and decided to spank their son. My aunt agreed but said my uncle had to be the one to do it, and he was very deliberate to do it the right way, calmed down first but not so long after the incident that the child forgot what it was about, one very mild pop to the bottom, allowed him to express how he felt about it and explained what was happening, didn't create a panicky buildup, you wait until your father gets home etc. and it worked. Almost overnight. They only spanked him a handful of times before the unbearable behavior literally completely stopped. Years of incredibly intentional parenting and alternative punishments and multiple therapies and dietary adjustments and anything else you can imagine did nothing, and a few pops to the behind over several months made him a totally different kid. He's almost 17 now and is a brilliant, talented, gentle giant of a kid with absolutely fantastic relationships with both of his parents. Standard growing up oddities and nothing more. I'd never suggest spanking your kid as option 1 or 2 or 3, and I completely understand how easy it is to do it in a way that is horrible and abusive. But I also think there are some children who will never, ever respond to any words or concepts or threats, and there are very clear physical and developmental risks to having a child that you absolutely cannot control in any way well into their school years. It's not as black and white an issue as we'd all prefer, unfortunately. It should be assessed on a singular basis and handled with extreme consideration. I was battered black and blue regularly as a kid. Hell, I am not saying I didn't deserve it, but it didn't stop me being naughty again either. So what does it really teach kids? Violence is acceptable? Now, as a parent myself, I have found many frustrating situations where the urge to lash out at the kid comes on. But I realized at some point that hitting a child comes from the frustration of the parent. People try to justify it, but ultimately it is a reflection on the adult and shows emotional immaturity. There are many efficient ways of disciplining kids without striking them. You did not deserve it. You are worth more than that. Anyone else thinking of the fly swatter? A horse bat, switches, and wooden spoons were my mom's weapons of choice. The wooden spoon. My mom would hit me with just about anything she could find. Like a loaf of bread, her purse, a belt, and hands. She stopped when I turned 17, but then she would curse me out anywhere we are. And my dad would do the exact same thing. And I was never a bad kid. But it was always because of something like arguing. I have never physically went against my parents, and I have always gotten the whooping of a lifetime. I don't have respect for them anymore, so once my grandparents are gone I don't know what I'm going to do. Similarly got spanked/assaulted by both parents. Usually for something like arguing with my siblings. I was actually a straight A honors student, piano, band, dance, sports, got a full ride to college and should have felt pretty good, but I was always made to feel bad. I could never look teachers or bosses in the eye because I felt like a fuck up. Lifelong self-esteem issues. Don't spank your kids. I was spanked 7 times in my life. It was right after I did something after told not to do so several times and was warned. It was one smack on the butt immediately after disobedience. It did not leave any lasting harm and the pain went away shortly after. Had my parents not done so, I don't think I would have taken them seriously. I believe this was necessary as timeout was just not effective. Not every kid is the same and sometimes there have to be negative consequences. I was not abused. Not every kid is the same. I think this is something a lot of the people here don't get. Sure, their child may have listened just fine without spanking, but not every child is the same. I firmly believe my parents would have done wrong if they hadn't punished me as they did. I would have been out of control. Same, I absolutely adore my parents and I wouldn't change them for the world. If I really crossed the line, I'd get a spank. It worked a lot better than a naughty step would have. It is absolutely a healthy way of parenting if done correctly. Spanking can absolutely be abuse, but it was not in my case. I was hit/spanked, slapped in the mouth when I gave lip, and got the belt after being locked in my room for hours to wait for me dad to come home to do it, and now that my husband and I are trying to have a baby, I'm really scared of continuing this cycle in moments of stress or exhaustion. Do any parents have resources or things that they've done to extend their patience or ways to curb the impulse to do it? I know I have the same impulse to hit because of the counter after grazing my hip on the corner, etc. Genuinely looking for help in how to curb that reaction in myself. I would recommend finding an EMDR therapist. I had unresolved issues from my upbringing. My mother would scream at me and issue corporal punishment for simple mistakes such as forgetting a school planner. It messed with my mind as a kid because I couldn't understand why someone who loved me would hurt me. When my son got to age 1, he was of course getting into things, as he lacked impulse control. Logically I knew that. However, something in my brain would get triggered and I would start yelling at him. I knew in the moment that I didn't want to, but I had difficulty turning it off. It was like my mother was spewing out of my mouth. I've never spanked him and I'm grateful for that. He will grow up to trust that the people who love him will not hurt him, no matter the reason. I started EMDR therapy, and since working through my own childhood trauma, I'm a much calmer parent. I think one of the biggest oversights in parenting is thinking kids are too young to understand just because they can't communicate back to you. It's never too early to explain things to your children. So don't underestimate the power of explanation. My son is now 2.5, and while I do still get frustrated, he doesn't see more than an exasperated tone. And guess what? Without any physical punishment, I have a toddler who is polite, well-mannered, cleans up after himself, and will willingly walk to his timeout spot to patiently serve out his 2-minute sentence. Because I was beaten as a kid and I turned out fine. People who did not in fact turn out fine, but aren't introspective or emotionally intelligent enough to realize it. Teresa, great difference between receiving a spanking and having the shit beat out of you. My mom was all I was beaten as a kid, and because of that I will never do that to you. Which was awesome, good for her for breaking the cycle. What she didn't do though, was get help for her anger management. She may not have hit me, but she did cross the line many times. You should never yell in your child's face until they have a panic attack. She still fucked up sometimes, but at least it wasn't beatings. My mother didn't spank us often, but I understood her reasoning for it. According to her, children under the age of 6 don't really have the capability of understanding why they don't have to do something. You can tell a kid 100 times that the stove is hot, it will burn them, and it will hurt. But kids still touch the burners because they don't have context for what that word means and they haven't experienced the consequences of doing something. But if a kid touches a burner even once, it's almost guaranteed they won't do it again. Same thing for spanking. If they do something they aren't supposed to, like running out in the street, they have no concept of how it could literally kill them. But if they are promised a consequence, like a spanking, it offers as a deterrent until they are older and you can reason with them. I won't use that when I finally have children, because my partner doesn't believe in it, but I understand the reasoning behind it. As a father of 3-year-old, they definitely do have an understanding. Never spanked my kid to prevent anything. It takes explaining, a lot of patience and maybe yelling once or twice, but there's definitely another way. I was spanked as a kid and I believe it's just an easy solution for a parent. Also, once you're out of sight the risk of spanking goes down, so kid might do something stupid anyway. I'll pop my kid's hand if they're reaching for a stove, or the dog's food bowl, or someone else's plate. More as a quick way to stop it, but not hard enough to hurt them, just get their attention before it's too late. Then I'll explain it to them. I was spanked a lot as a kid, with a belt, and probably deserved more than I got. So far my kid responds well to correction. You did not deserve to get beaten with a belt. There's no reason to justify your abuser's behavior. If you want to see more content like this, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for daily uploads. After you've done that, check out one of our other videos.